Hello world and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect at Windows. Today we're going to be taking a break from our usual Azure content to look at Windows 11 and its hardware compatibility issues. Hi guys, today I wanted to take a break from my usual Azure content to talk about something that's kind of controversial, and that's Windows 11. No, I'm not talking about the centered start menu. That's very easy to fix with a taskbar setting when you can put it back in the lower left corner where it belongs. I'm actually going to be talking about the hardware requirements for Windows 11. Now, this is become an issue because some of the hardware requirements for Windows 11 are not necessarily based on performance. It's based on the availability of certain kinds of security features and things like that available on some PCs. And I wanted to unpack what these hardware requirements mean and how they play into the Windows 11 operating system. And then I wanted to do a survey of a bunch of machines that I have in my home as to whether or not they're going to be able to run Windows 11. And the answer is not exactly clear, but I wanted to make some projections based on the research that I performed and then point you to resources that you can use to figure out whether or not your machine will be able to run Windows 11 or not. So these are the system requirements that Microsoft has published for Windows 11. Now, this as a recording this video, what they are saying. Now, this could change between now and the release dates. In fact, it has changed somewhat even in the last week. So I am publishing this with that caveat. Now, the first three requirements, processor, RAM, and storage, are pretty standard for most modern PCs at the most basic entry-level PC that you can get. In fact, I just bought one not too long ago that has all of these specs, except it has a little bit more storage, but it's a 2-core processor at 1.9 gigahertz with 4 gigabytes of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. That would be more than enough to run Windows 11 according to this. In fact, old PCs that you might have laying around your house probably have similar specs to this as well. And the one machine that I'm going to be looking at later on has these specs, but it's a machine that was manufactured in like 2012. Now, the controversy around the hardware requirements isn't around processor, RAM, and storage, which were typically used as the kind of benchmark for saying that Windows would run on a system. Rather, it's some of these other things that are available on PCs now concerning the system configuration and system firmware, a TPM, and a graphics card. So the system firmware is requiring UEFI, which is not that controversial. That's been around for the better part of 15 years now. It's having secure boot capable. That's fairly common in most modern PCs for the last 10 or 15 years or so. It's having this guy right here that has become the controversy, the TPM, the Trusted Platform Module. We'll get into what that is in a moment. And then also what's controversial is the graphics card requirements for this running DirectX 12 or WDDM 2.0, and we'll talk about why that could possibly be a caveat for running Windows 11 in a minute as well. So with this in mind, I really want to focus mostly on what a TPM is and what it does and why Windows 11 is demanding that, and then talk about why the graphics could be a problem for some machines, and not all machines, but it could be a problem for some machines, and that would be a reason that Windows 11 wouldn't run. So let's go talk about the TPM real quick and what it does and why Windows 11 is requiring that as basic hardware for it to run. So what is the TPM anyway? A TPM stands for Trusted Platform Module, and it provides services to your machine that are cryptographically oriented. Two of the most important ones that is cryptographic keys. So it has a kind of root key that is used for a number of different things on your system. And it also provides hardware implementations of common hash algorithms. So a TPM is there to ensure that there is the ability to perform things like hashes and cryptographic keys at the hardware level and in a hardware implementation to ensure that your machine has not been tampered with by malicious code. So basically by running a hash against something like the firmware or against the boot sector or the operating system, you can ensure that the actual software has not been modified by some malicious code that has been installed that can't be detected when the machine loads or boots or whatever it might be. The way a TPM works is when you start your machine up, you load something called the UEFI. And sometimes people refer to this as a BIOS, but a BIOS is really an older term that was the firmware before UEFI became a thing. Sometimes I even refer to the BIOS as UEFI or the UEFI as a BIOS and use those terms interchangeably, but UEFI is the proper term for it in most modern PCs going back probably 10 years or more. And the UEFI boots up first, and it loads a basic set of drivers that allows you to have some basic functionality for the machine to then load the operating system. But one of the things that the UEFI does is accesses the TPM to load those cryptographic keys and access those hash algorithms. And when it does that, it then reads from the boot drive of the machine some data about that boot drive, and it checks that data off the boot drive against the cryptographic keys and the hashes that are stored on the TPM. Now, it's not necessarily doing full disk encryption, but it is making sure that the boot sector and things like that haven't been tampered with by malicious code by doing those hash checks and cryptographic key checks against the boot sector of a given disk. Now, if everything checks out and there's a match, then nothing's changed and everything is cool. And then it will then hand control back over to the operating system to continue booting. And the operating system can then take over and do its thing. But that process of checking the boot sector is called secure boot. And that is the feature that Windows 11 is demanding be installed on a machine and be activated in order for Windows 11 to be installed on that machine. And this is to ensure that the stuff that's prior to Windows 11 actually loading is secure, and then Windows 11 itself will then itself be checking other things such as passwords and other kinds of disk encryption if you're using that. And OSs and apps can then access the TPM and the hash algorithms on the TPM for the same kinds of purposes. But secure boot is one of the main reasons that Windows 11 is demanding that a TPM be installed. Now, there's a lot of other things that are related to a TPM that are part of Windows 11, but the secure boot is the main reason. And TPM version 2 is the controversy because that standard came out in 2015. Now, the system requirements for TPM version 2 dictate that older machines probably won't be able to run Windows 11 because they don't have TPM version 2 on them. Now, I say probably because it's not exactly clear. Originally, Microsoft had published that TPM 1.2 might be acceptable in some cases, and TPM 2.0 being the preferred standard. TPM 1.2 goes back to 2005, and if that is the case, then older machines still yet may be able to run Windows 11. And it's not exactly clear as to what this is going to be whenever Windows 11 launches. But right now, Microsoft is saying TPM 2 is what they're demanding. But it's still not 100% sure whether or not that's actually going to be a hard requirement or it's just going to be a recommended requirement, with the hard requirement being TPM version 1.2. So DirectX 12 and WDDM 2 are two other things that Microsoft are requiring for Windows 11. Now, we can think about this by thinking about applications that need to render graphics. Now, these typically use one of these different APIs, as they're typically called. They're graphics APIs that are built into the Windows operating system. So DirectX 12 is typically used by games like 3D games that you might be playing, or by many things that do video rendering and sound rendering. So DirectX is very important for the media experience that's part of the Windows operating system, as well as a lot of those more immersive type games. WDDM is another API that is used by graphics processors that is useful for things like static content like text and windows and graphics that are just images and those kinds of things. And both of these APIs are used in various applications for different purposes. Now, another one that I have here is OpenGL, which is another API that is open source that is available on Windows, but also runs on things like Linux and macOS as well. So OpenGL is used for graphics and these contexts, but is often used in Windows for cross-platform applications. And all of these APIs are used by applications as a way to interact with a graphics driver or video driver. And the video driver is software that comes from the device manufacturer, that is typically an Intel processor or NVIDIA or an AMD processor or other companies that are building GPUs. And the video driver then will take the instructions from one of those APIs and translate that into something that is understandable by the actual graphics processor unit, the GPU, which is the hardware that is installed in your PC. And then that then displays the results on a screen. Now, the reason that DirectX 12 and WDDM 2 are required for Windows 11 is because these APIs are part of what Windows 11 is going to be exposing for the graphical experiences that are going to be a part of Windows 11. Now, DirectX 12 and WDDM are fairly new in terms of what Microsoft has historically required for an operating system, and both of these standards came out around 2015. Having said that, though, that doesn't mean that older hardware won't work with these newer standards, and we'll look at a couple of examples of that in a minute. But the reason why this one could be a problem is because older hardware might not be compatible with the minimal DirectX 12 or WDDM 2 requirement. Historically, Microsoft has worked around this by providing a generic driver that allowed you to run the operating system using a basic driver, even if it didn't have some of the accelerations available by some of the hardware that is rendered from the actual hardware acceleration from the GPU. And that was typically taken on by the CPU. It performed much worse, but it still lets you use the operating system even if the hardware acceleration wasn't there. But that seems to be going away now, and the requirement for these two APIs will then be requiring a GPU that supports them going forward. So I wanted to run a little utility on my machine called Why Not Win 11, and this is basically going to detect, based on my machine, whether or not I meet the basic system requirements for Windows 11. Now, this utility is in flux, so it's going through a lot of changes rapidly, and the requirements do seem to be shifting back and forth. So this is something that you probably need to take with a little bit of skepticism, but it does, based on the requirements for Windows 11, detect what you might have concerning your machine and whether or not it will be able to run Windows 11 or not. So you can get this by going to a website. Just simply type in whynotwin11.org and it'll take you to this GitHub repository, and then you can scroll down here and download that utility. Now, it does display a screen that looks like this. Since I already downloaded it, I'm just going to run it. Now, if you run it, you'll probably get a screen that says, do you want to run this application? Yes. You want to do you want to run it? And then you can run it, and you'll get a screen that looks like this. That's going to detect whether or not your machine will be capable of running Windows 11. Now, I ran this utility on a number of different machines that I have laying around, so I wanted to walk through the results of that just to kind of show you the scope and scale of what you might have concerning Windows 11. This particular machine I'm running this on now, of course, is going to run it. It's a fairly new machine that's got all the right requirements for it, and so I don't think I'll have any issues with Windows 11 on this machine, but other machines I'm going to show you might have other issues that might be for running Windows 11. So this is the first machine I looked at. I call it my old PC. It is basically an old HP EliteBook that I got several years ago off eBay for my wife to use, and she's since got a newer machine, but I use it mostly now for my daughters to be able to watch videos and play games and things like that. And of course, I didn't expect this one to be able to run it given the requirements it has, but it does have a CPU that is very capable of running it from a performance perspective. But the blockers on this one, of course, are going to be DirectX and WDDM2 and the TPM version here, because this does not have DirectX 12 and it doesn't have TPM2. So this one obviously is going to be a little bit harder to run it on. Now, I could probably fix the boot mode and the boot problems with this if I was going to the BIOS and tweak it to use some of those features, and we'll see that I can do that on other examples that we're going to look at. But this one, not expecting to be able to run Windows 11 on it. So I have another machine that I got around 2013 that I call my server, and that's kind of what I use it for. It's just basically a file server. It does a few other things, but I ran the utility on this guy, and this one was a little bit surprising in that because it came out in 2013, it was a little bit before the introduction of DirectX 12 and WDDM 2, but the GPU in this one did support it. It's an old EliteBook workstation, and it has a Quadro K2000M in it, which I guess is DirectX 12 compatible and WDDM2 compatible. The blocker on this one is probably going to be the TPM, which is version 1.2, and that TPM was built before the a standard was established for TPM version 2. It might be possible to run Windows 11 on this, depending on whether or not that requirement for TPM2 is actually true. Again, there is some question as to whether or not that it will be a problem on older machines. The boot problems, again, can be solved very easily if I go into the BIOS and then tweak that and get secure boot installed, and then be able to use that with this particular machine. So I don't foresee any problems there, but this one might be able to. So it's still up in the air as to whether or not this one will be supported. Another machine that I got in Q2 of 2016, this used to be my old work machine. I call it a gaming PC because it was marketed as such. But this one, basically everything wrong with it is the boot configuration that I have currently installed on it. Now I can go again into the BIOS and tweak the BIOS to turn on secure boot and use a more modern partitioning format. Instead of NVR, I could use GPT and turn on secure boot in the BIOS or the UEFI and fix these problems, then reinstall Windows 11 on it, and it would be just fine. I'm pretty confident that this one's going to be able to run it without any issue. The next one is a newer machine, but it's got the TPM issue. So this one is a case where the utility detected TPM 1.2, even though that this machine came out in 2017. Now, this is a desktop machine that I use for a lot of lab type work and desktop type work, and it has UEFI BIOS or boot mode. It's got secure boot enabled, and it's got a GPT installed. So all the basic requirements for the secure boot that are there, and it's also got a RTX 2060 on it, which of course is going to be DirectX 12 and WDDM2 compatible. So this one is kind of questionable. I'm willing to bet that this one will, because this one might be in a special class of PCs that do enable it. Now, two other machines that I do want to look at for this are my so-called work PC. And my work PC is the one that I actually just ran the demo on. And this one is 64-bit OS, it's got UEFI installed, it's got DirectX 12, and it's got a RTX 2060, of course, and it's got a fairly modern CPU, and it's got secure boot enabled, and all the other requirements are there. So I have no questions about this one. This one will probably get Windows 11 first anyways, among my PCs that I'm going to be using it on. And so I'm going to install this particular piece in Windows 11 when it becomes generally available on this machine. Now, there's another machine that I recently got that is kind of a bare bones PC, a very basic PC. And this particular PC was one I got for doing book writing on. I'm a novelist, so I like to have something that I can just kind of throw in a backpack and take with me anywhere I go. This is basically used for running Microsoft Word. And it's got the bare minimum requirements, entry-level PC. It's got a 2-core processor at 1900 megahertz, 4 gigs of RAM, and a 120 gigabyte hard drive. So very basic machine. It's got a really long battery life, and that's the main reason I got it. But it's got a UEFI, it's got TPM2, and it's got secure boot and all that other stuff that it needs to run. So this one will probably be able to run Windows 11 without any issue. Now, to look at the summary of these 6 machines that we just looked at, it might look like this. So my old machine, I'm not counting on this one being able to run Windows 11. Now, I'll be surprised if it does. If it does, then great, then I'll be like happy because of that. However, my so-called server machine, I'm not highly confident that that one's going to be able to run it because of that old TPM version, although the GPU is capable of running the actual graphics components that are required for Windows 11. My gaming machine definitely will be able to, so-called gaming machine, I don't really use it for that anymore. It's just mainly a backup machine in case my main machine dies. Desktop machine, Maybe. I'm going to hold out on this one. I think it will, just because this one's in a class of machines that I think might be supported, even though they don't have TPM2 installed. There seems to be this special class of machine that if a manufacturer will do certain things to the machine, that Microsoft will allow the operating system to be installed on it. So I'm going to give that one a maybe. My work PC and my small PC, I'm certainly are pretty certain that that one will be able to run Windows 11. So in summary, 3 yeses, 2 maybes, and 1 definitely no. Now, how does this relate to your PC? Now, the best advice that I could give you is if your machine is made within the last 3 years or so, probably going to be the case that you can run Windows without Windows 11 without a problem. So maybe 2018, 19, 20, and even the first half of 2021, you should be able to run it without a problem. The second kind of tier here, the after 2015 era, whenever TPM 2 was launched and after the DirectX 12 standard was launched and the WDDM 2 standard was launched, is a possible maybe, depending on the hardware. As we saw with my desktop PC, it's running an older version of TPM, even though it was built at a later date, 2017. However, this earlier machine here was capable of running TPM version 2, even though it was built before my desktop PC. So if your machine was built in this era, it might be possible to run it. Now, before 2015, that would be these kind of 2 machines up here. It's probably not the case. I'm not going to have a high confidence level that my so-called server or my old PC, they're going to get Windows 11. It might be the case that Microsoft changes some of those requirements between now and then, and I'm able to install it, and it's just known that there are certain security caveats that allow me to run this operating system, even though it's not ideal. So in that case, if I'm going to get any kind of new operating system, and it's just likely going to be a Linux-based operating system, especially on that old PC, if I want to have anything beyond that, or I can just continue to use what's currently installed on them for probably the next few years while Microsoft supports it. Windows 10 is on my old PC there, and it'll probably be well supported for another 4 years. And by that time, that machine is probably going to be about 13, 14 years old and probably needs to be retired anyway. So just something to think about there. So basically look at your machine's manufacture date, try to figure out when it is, and based on these kind of timelines here, you could probably get a high level of confidence if it's newer. If it's not new, maybe, and hold out and just see. And then if it's really old, probably older than 2015, then the probably not going to be able to run Windows 11. So that would be my guidance there, if your machine will be able to run Windows 11 or not. Having said that, though, I do want to look at a machine that I have Windows 11 preview installed on, and I'm going to run that same utility on. So I'm remoted into a Windows 11 box here, and this is a Windows 11 installed on my desktop PC. Now this is that one that did have that TPM version 1.2. Being that this is a preview build, it does appear to work on TPM 1.2, but this is not generally available, so I cannot assume that this will work on a generally available version of Windows. However, it does appear to be running. Here's the controversial start menu on the left. If you don't like it, it's very easy to change. If you want it back in the center, you can put it there or on the left, depending on what your preference might be. Now, I'm going to run that Why Not Windows 11 utility on Windows 11, and just to show you that it's going to detect that I don't have TPM version 2 installed. It's detecting 1.2 on this particular machine. So this is why I'm calling this a maybe. And I did mention a special class of machines that might be able to run Windows 11 even though they have an older version of a TPM installed, and that largely depends on the contracts that OEM might have with Microsoft. If they can get the machine to run Windows 11 and get the appropriate security requirements in play, Microsoft might allow special dispensations for older hardware such as TPM version 1.2. I have a feeling that this one might be one of those machines. This is an HP Z240, which is built around 2017 with some fairly decent hardware specs. And being that it's not that old, even though it has TPM version 1.2 installed, it might get a special dispensation to allow Windows 11. I don't know that though, so it might be that I can't run Windows 11 on this particular machine. But in any case, it's just a certain stroke of irony that this utility says Windows 11 won't run, but I'm running a preview build of Windows 11 to run this utility. In any case, this is just something to keep an eye on, and might be one of those in that range of time where it may or may not be supported. So I'm going to hold my breath on this and wait for a generally available version of Windows to come out before I actually commit to running Windows 11 on this particular machine.
If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintelect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintelect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintelect on Twitter at WintelectNow or at Wintelect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintelect.com. Until next time, thank you.